Let's begin our study on the book of Deuteronomy. The word Deuteronomy means second law. Deutero, second, nomi, law. When you read this book, it really appears like you're reading a repeat of what you just read in the previous few books. Question is, why? Well, this time, what we thought was a repeat to us is not a repeat to the people this book was addressed to. This book was addressed to a different generation from those who were addressed in the previous books. The whole generation of the Israelites who came out of Egypt had died. At this point, only 3 of those original adults were alive: Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. All the rest had died in the wilderness. Reason? The Bible tells us that when God asked them to enter the promised land, they refused. Though Joshua and Caleb begged them and said, "Come on, let's go in." They said, "No, we're not going to go in." And so they really didn't want to go in. They said, "We want to go back to Egypt." And so God said, "All right, if you don't want to go in, you don't have to." So, one by one, they died. And after 40 years, all had died except the ones who did not rebel: Moses, Joshua, and Caleb. Now, so this was a totally new generation. This generation were kids at that time. They were not guilty of the sin, neither were they able to remember what was told to their parents by Moses at Sinai. God had given the law at Sinai, was given to them in Exodus, in Leviticus, in the early part of Numbers, but this generation needed to hear it. So it's a new generation. Therefore, it seems like a repeat of what was read. Now, we will see in Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 2, Deuteronomy 1 verse 2, that the journey actually from Mount Sinai to where they were now at this point of the book is only an 11-day journey, but they took almost 40 years to do the journey. Why did God take so long? Right? Of course, the reason was the spies went into the land to spy it out for 40 days, and so 1 year for every day, but also so that they would all just die off. And they didn't want to go in. They said, "We will not go in." God said, "You won't go in. It's okay." So they traveled very, very slowly during this time. They went to about 40 locations, spent 1 year there, waiting to die, so to speak. Right? And so now finally, they're about to enter the promised land. Now, the Bible tells us that these are really the last words of Moses to them, because he's not allowed to go in. He had disobeyed God at the waters of Meribah, where God said, "Speak to the rock," but he struck it twice. And you can't strike the rock twice, because the rock is Christ. Christ was struck just once, and that was earlier on in Rephidim, I believe. Okay, so Moses disobeyed God. He's also not going to go in. But now Moses is there with this generation, and he knows he can't go into the promised land with them. So he's very concerned. He's very, very concerned that when they enter the promised land, they will fall into the temptations of the land. So these are literally his last words. Like a father cannot be around for his kids, he's giving everything he has. Very passionate speeches of Moses before he says goodbye to them and they enter into the promised land. Can you imagine the anticipation, after 40 years, finally we're in a place of rest. Instead, we don't know where we are, we keep moving. Finally, we get that beautiful land. All the houses are ready, the cities are already built, the houses are filled with things. The wells are dug, the olive trees are matured, the grapevines, the figs, everything is there, right? All ready, and we're just dying to go in. Now, the structure of this book, if you're a lawyer, you will begin to see it. You see, this book is written like what we call a sovereign treaty between two parties. The conquering nation makes a treaty with the smaller nation, right, the strong nation, and says, if you will obey all these things, then I will protect you or take care of you, etc. Okay, so if you're a lawyer, you begin to see, because you've written agreements before, you will see that this is actually structured like the way an agreement would be written. A bit of historical prologue, blah, blah, blah. I wouldn't bore you because you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer. I didn't see it until I was studying this. But for a lawyer, they probably would pick this up. Moses was trained in Egypt. He was trained for 40 years as a kind of, in the family of Pharaoh. So he knew how to write a treaty. But if you and I as lay people see this book, we see this book not so much as a sovereign treaty, but as three major speeches. Moses is told, in 7 days' time, you will die. Wow, I got 7 days to tell this generation what to do. So basically, Moses probably spoke on day one, a long sermon, last words. You got to keep saying a lot of things you wanted to say. Then day 2, he probably wrote it down. Day 3, he probably spoke again another long. Day 4, he probably wrote it down. Day 5, he gave the third and last speech. Then day 6, he wrote it down. Day 7, he died. That's probably what it was. So after he wrote it all down, he passed the law to the priests, and the priests were supposed to put it all by the side of the ark, and every 7 years they were to read this law, book of Deuteronomy, to the people, to the Jews, Israelites. Okay, so basically that is the structure of the book. You and I will see as lay people 3 long, passionate, personal speeches from Papa Moses to his spiritual children. Now, the 3 speeches can be divided into past, present, and future. Past, looking back, past reflections, recollections, is a small part of the book. Present, responsibilities, present rules and regulations, what you must do. Big chunk of Deuteronomy. Future, if you do all this, you will have future rewards, or if you don't do them, you have future retribution. Significant part, but much smaller than the major part is your responsibility. Rules and regulations for you now. I hope you understand the importance of this structure, right? Looking back is very important to see what God has done. It encourages us. It gives us enough faith to go on. It helps us to know this God we're going to serve better. We can learn lessons from the past. But don't look back too much. A lot of churches spend all the time looking back on their glory days. Don't do that. Enough. Look back to thank God. Then, what are our responsibilities now? That's the most important. What we have to do now. That should be our focus. And then, if we do all this, this is how God would bless us. This is how things would progress. Future. Not so big a chunk, right? Some people always visioning, talking about the future. What about now? What are you doing now? What are your responsibilities, right? So we see this book's divided into 3 parts. Past, small. Present responsibilities or rules and regulations for our life, big. Future, what will happen, big, but not as big as the present, right? So small, huge chunk, and then medium-sized chunk. So we have S, L in the middle, present responsibilities, M, future. Okay, so roughly, let's look at the past reflections or past recollections. That's found in chapters 1 to 4, looking back. Seems very brief, like 40 years are just squashed into the past reflections. Okay, so that's what we should learn to do. Looking back at the past, thank you, God. Thank you for being with me. I was so unfaithful, but you were good. That's encouragement to us. Then our present. So the first speech gets over in 4 chapters. I'm sure now he spent a lot of time telling them on day 1, 2 for speech, pass. Then on day 3, likely, he spent the same time, whole day, giving them their regulations, but a lot of it is recorded down, okay, to tell us how important it is. Okay, so they were given a whole bunch of laws, whole bunch of regulations for them to sink into their head, to think about, so that when they entered the promised land, they were ready for the temptations of the promised land. Now they were going to cross the Jordan, enter into a very occupied land. There were 7 nations at that time, very strong nations. And these 7 strong nations, their civilization is so much higher than the slaves who were in the desert. They were really like country bumpkins. They knew nothing. Once they come to these new civilizations, they would be amazed, attracted by them, and tempted to imitate them. And these 7 nations had some common characteristics that united them in a sense, certain 7 types of behavior. Number 1, they were all immoral nations. Number 2, they were lots of injustice among them. Number 3, the worst of all, they were idolatrous, hugely idolatrous. All right? So all these 7 nations had these 3 common sins: immorality, injustice, idolatry. Now, immorality was huge. Fornication, normal. Everybody had sex with everybody. Adulteries, very common. Divorce, remarriage, very common. Sodomy, very common. Incest, even within families, very normal. You say, how come everything like that so bad? Even sex with animals? Why everybody is sex obsessed? Well, because their religion was largely based on sex. You say, well, what do you mean, religion based on sex? You see, they believe in the concept of fertility. Their religion was basically fertility cults. They believed the land produced a lot because it was fertile. And just as humans need to have a lot of sex to have a lot of babies, and if humans had a lot of sex, it will make the land more fertile. Well, it's kind of bizarre, but that's how they believe. They believe Mother Earth was the religion of Mother Earth. Today we keep hearing that term. Rather than Father God, it's Mother Earth, right? We think the earth is the main thing. So let's make the earth fertile. So their whole religion was based on fertility, which to the human mind is sex, right? So they had temple prostitutes. Their religion was based, you want to have worship your God, go and have sex in the temple. When you have sex in the temple, you make your land more fertile, right? And so that's how they believe. So often our gods determine our behavior. If our God is very harsh, our laws can be very harsh. If our God is very gracious, then our laws, our behavior can be very gracious. If our God is very swift to anger, then we as people tend to take revenge very quickly. But if our God is patient, then our behavior tends to be patient. If our God is holy, then we tend to live holy lives. If our God is very lax on these things, then our behavior becomes very lax. So a lot of times when you see the behavior of a certain culture of people, you can reflect it back to what is their religion, which probably rules the way they behave. Okay, injustice. Second one, immorality everywhere. Injustice, terrible. The rich really took advantage of the poor and the weak. Example, slaves were treated just as property. Foreigners were treated as nothing, right? Because they had no power. We had power. Women were treated really low because men had the power. So injustice was the poor became poorer and poorer because of usury, of lending money at ridiculous rates, until there were just a few rich guys in the whole culture. So in unjust culture, the poor were really treated like the blind, the weak were just treated like nothing. Injustice. Lastly, idolatry. So immorality, injustice, idolatry. Wow, there were idols everywhere. God for everything. Under every tree there was some kind of idol, you know. Some countries are like that. Today, so idolatrous. Okay? So when we understand these three common things, we understand why the laws tend to address immorality, injustice, and idolatry. All right? So if you look at the laws, and you're going to see, whoa, from chapter 5 to chapter 26, 20 over chapters of all kinds of laws. Okay? But if you look at it, they all address these three basic issues. Okay? Now, let's look at some features of these 20 over chapters of rules, present regulations, right? That present responsibilities they must have as they enter the land. Number one, the one that strikes me the most is the repetition of the word one God. Worship one God in one place rather than multiple gods under multiple trees, multiple rocks, multiple mountains. Okay? One God, one place to worship. See, you understand why is God keep emphasizing this? Because they were going to enter a place where there was multiple gods and multiple altars and shrines everywhere. Number two, you will find that the laws seem all mixed up. For our way of thinking, we like to see things more systematic, okay? How we worship in church, that's the rules. How we behave in the family, how we then behave in society. We like to see things systematic. The laws here, when you read them, seem all mixed up. One hand, the verses will talk about how to sacrifice animals in the tabernacle. Wow, details. Suddenly, the next law is about when you build a house, don't forget to put on your rooftop, don't forget to put a barricade so that people don't fall over, because that is not good. It's not fair. Some kids may play on the roof and drop over and die. Oh, it's like, what's that got to do with worship? And then the next, almost immediately comes after that, something about don't forget to pay your slaves and your servants on time. Don't hold back their salary. Huh? It's like, why is all these laws mixed up? I think God is trying to teach us something very important that we modern Christians don't quite get. We like to divide the sacred from the secular. We go to church, we behave one way. We think about, oh, this is about God. Then we go to office, we behave another way. This is corporate. I can do a lot of things here. But on Sunday, no, these things I cannot do. Right? So we have this separation of, or when I go to play sports, there's another way I can behave like a terrible guy in the sports field because it's nothing to do with God. No. All these laws are mixed up to tell us that whatsoever you do, whether you eat or drink, do to the glory of God. In other words, worship is not what we do on Sunday for 2 hours. When we sing some songs and listen to a sermon and put some offerings in, that's one part of our worship. Worship is whatever we do to the glory of God. Right? So that's why it's all mixed up to tell you God is as concerned about how you make an offering in the tabernacle as you are how you pay your salaries fairly to your employees. Right? And how your house should be. Whether it infringes on your neighbor's property or infringes your neighbor's privacy, things like that. All that is worship. But for the modern Christian mind, no, that's not worship. That's separate. Okay? So we say, let's go and worship God today. It's like, no, let's worship God 24/7. But all that we do, everything we do, we say, how does this glorify God? So for modern mind, very difficult. So God purposely mixes it up, knowing that in the future we'll have this Greek mind. The Greek always like to divide body and soul and all that. It's just all one. I mean, where's the body begin, the soul, the spirit? I don't know. It's all one, right? Number 3 feature is, please don't compare these laws to present-day modern laws. If you compare them to present-day modern laws, you say, what's the big deal about these laws? In fact, some of them look pretty archaic. They even talk about slaves, and they even talk about things that you and I would say, nothing great about this law. Remember, this law was given to the Israelites 1,000 over years ago, almost 2,000 years ago. Okay? You must compare this law at that time with other laws of that time. This law was not given for us. This law was given for them. Not for us today, but for them at that time. Living in that culture, in that era. In fact, today, when we look at the laws, we think our laws today are even better than these laws. And you know why? Particularly people who live in Singapore. We have British laws. And British laws, unashamedly, were taken from the Bible. King Alfred took British laws, basically from the Bible, and then tweaked it for modern times. Or more modern times, I'll put it that way, all right? So British law always evolved that it now looks so good, but actually it's from the Bible, okay? And it's evolved from this time. So when you look at this law, compared with the laws of those days of their neighbors, now all cultures had basically some things in common. Almost all laws, whether it was in China, Indus Valley, Egypt, basically killing someone for no reason is wrong. Basically, stealing someone's else's wife, is wrong. Almost all cultures. Basically, lying to your friend is wrong. Right? So, that's actually the conscience of man that writes these laws. These are the laws written in our heart. So all these were the same. But the laws we are reading here in Deuteronomy, compared to the other laws, are superior. For example, in these laws, slaves had rights. In other laws at that time, slaves zero rights. Here, women had rights in this. You have to treat them properly. In other laws, women are your property. Do whatever you want. Foreigners, do whatever you want with them. Right? So kings were above the law in other cultures. Here, kings were to follow the law. The kings were also under this law. So all people under the same law, whether you were king or whether you were a slave. So when you compare this law, please don't compare it with today's law, which is taken from this law and tweaked and improved and fitted into the modern times. So you can't compare that, right? Number 4, these laws, as opposed to other laws of their time in Deuteronomy, it's basically thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. Other laws is if you do this, this will be your punishment or your reward. Okay? Now, why is there a difference? Because this law is given by God. God can tell you, you cannot do that. You cannot do that. Right? Other laws are written by men and say, well, if you do it, this is your punishment. Okay? So you see here, the laws here were strong laws given from a sovereign God. Number 5, some of these laws are very weird, extremely weird. For example, some of them say you cannot mix wool and linen in the same cloth. You say, what? My clothes are all mixed, right? How come? Because this addresses an issue they will face when they enter the promised land. What is that issue? Again, it's about fertility. They always believe when you had sex with another type, it improves things, improves the fertility. It's like hybridization. So you mix animals, you mix plants, you mix. So here it says no mixture. Now you get it. It's because of the fertility cult they're going into, where men have sex with animals. That's good, man. Said no mixture, man. All right, humans are humans. Another one, for example, you cannot, in Deuteronomy 14 verse 21, very strange one, you cannot boil a kid, a baby goat, in the mother's milk. You say, what's this? Well, in those days, boiling a baby kid in the mother's milk is like the baby having sex with the mother. And that's good. Incest is okay. In fact, it increases fertility. Oh my goodness. So don't boil a kid in the mother's milk, because that's what they do, thinking that, all right, this is another kind of fertility. So some of the rules here don't make any sense to us, but it was not for us. It was for the Israelites entering the promised land. I hope you get it, okay? So sometimes you read, it's very strange, but don't worry, it's not for you, right? Some of those laws were specific for them. Number 6 and last, get principles out of this, okay? Rather than just looking at the law and saying exactly what does this mean, but rather see the principle behind it. For example, Deuteronomy 25 verse 14, Deuteronomy 25 verse 14 says, don't muzzle the ox that treads the corn. So when an ox is pulling the millstone to mill corn, you cannot close his mouth. But if you don't close his mouth, he will eat the corn sometimes. He will stop and eat the corn. That's okay. All right? Because in 1 Corinthians, Paul says the principle of this, is it not written in the law of Moses that you cannot muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn? The principle is, when someone takes care of your spiritual needs, please feed him. Please take care of your pastor. Please take care of the full-time workers who serve in God's work. Feed them. Okay? So basically, Paul is trying to tell them, don't muzzle the ox. It's not so much about God caring for the ox, but God's principle is that if someone does his work properly, feed him properly. That's all. Okay? So you see, Deuteronomy 25:14 is explained in 1 Corinthians 9 to 11. The principle behind it. So I hope you see, when you see all this bundle of laws here, get your context right. It was for the Israelites entering into a land full of incest, immorality, full of injustice, and full of idolatry. Okay? So for you and me, it's like some of these laws are like nothing to do with me, right? But get the context right. So you don't really need to read them and underline everyone because it's specifically for the Israelites entering into a particular place at a particular time, right? So principles can be learned, but not necessarily the methods and the details. Okay. Now, I want you to note that when we see spiritual laws, I hope you understand that if you look at all this, there are three levels of our life. Okay? First, we do a lot of unclean things, wrong things. We didn't know they were wrong. We lie, white lie. Not that bad, It's unclean, but we didn't realize. For unsafe people, yeah, I'm not married yet. I can have fornication before I get married, go to a prostitute. That's okay. That's normal, So that's unclean. Then when we get saved, we realize unclean. This is unclean. Now I better become clean up. I better try not to lie. I shouldn't have sex outside of my marriage, Okay, so unclean to clean. That's a level. But you'll notice that a lot of these laws is not about unclean to clean, but from unclean to clean to sacred. Oh, three levels, huh? Unclean, clean, and sacred. Or we say bad behavior, good behavior, and godly behavior. Oh, okay. So there are actually three levels, not unclean, now unclean. Pastor, now I be careful what I say, right? I don't say bad words anymore. I'm more careful what I say. Good. If you're unclean, your mouth to clean. But then, let's move to one level. Clean is not enough. Clean is decent. So decent people in the world are not believers. Very decent. Their lives are very decent. They don't have adultery. They don't lie. They don't cheat a lot outwardly. All right? Their lives are good. You have to move one more level up. From clean to sacred. What do you mean by sacred? You do it for God. You're not just doing so that you look okay, but now you do it specifically to glorify God, to please God. So from unclean to clean to sacred. So this is the cleaning process, this is the consecrating process from here to here. Okay? Give you an example. If I preach a beautiful sermon, great truths, is that sacred? May not be. Because I'm preaching to show off how much I know of theology. What I've done is, I've done a beautiful lecture on Deuteronomy. But if I did this for the glory of God, I want God to be glorified in this effort, then I've turned what was a clean speech into a sacred speech. See, so even doing something like preaching can be just at this level. Common, not sacred. If I'm a taxi driver and I drive a taxi, sounds very decent job. I drive, I don't cheat anybody, clean. But I drive for the glory of God. Okay? Maybe in my taxi there's a cross, there's a Bible verse, and I'm the best taxi driver. I'm polite and kind, and all I did was drive. But I wanted to drive so that my passenger will realize the driver is a Christian, and this is the most polite, kind driver. He carried my bags, put it in the trunk of the taxi, and was polite and thanked me and said, "Sir, thank you for, You know what? Even driving can be sacred." I hope you get my point here. As Christians, we don't just try to lead decent lives, but whatever we do, eat or drink, do it for the glory of God. So that moves up from unclean, clean to sacred or godly. Now when you see so many laws, you say, "Ayo, so many laws." Remember, In this book of Deuteronomy, the word love appears 30 over times. Love and law are related. Jesus said in John 14 verse 15, if you love me, keep my commandments. I hope you get it. God's going to send them to the promised land. He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. You say, but it's so legalistic, so many laws. No, legalistic doesn't mean more laws. Many laws doesn't mean legalistic. Legalistic means I do all these laws hoping to get saved. That's legalistic, right? I hope you understand the difference. As a believer, I do all these things not hoping to get saved because I love God. I want God to be glorified by my life. If you love me, keep my commandments. Okay? So when you see a lot of laws, don't say, oh, legal, legal, all legal. No, no. If you obey laws for the glory of God, that's called love, not legalism. So I hope we get this thing now. Let me just summarize very quickly. The whole book has 3 speeches, Moses' 3 speeches. Looking back, small part, letter S, small size. Present laws, present responsibilities, L size. Then we'll move on to the next lesson to medium size, future reward or retribution.